Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this week feels kind of weird to me. And it shouldn't, given that a significant chunk of what I'm covering here, it's pop music that'll likely draw a lot of attention, or at least I hope it will. Maybe it's because so much else dropped today that it feels like I'm already chasing a pretty loaded schedule. But before we get to all that soon, let's get on the pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first start off with, from Grove, Queer and Wack. Yes, I went Bandcamp diving again, and wow, this is a gem to find. The best way to describe this EP from Grove is, okay, remember Shy Girl? Add breakbeats, stronger grooves with hints of dancehall, sharper hooks, some twinges of metallic hyperpop in the production, and a hard, non-binary, intersectional leftism, and yeah, it's really great. The biggest surprise for me here isn't just how hard it goes, but when you have this much clattering abrasion, it's legit impressive to also have well-balanced production and legit pop craftsmanship in the hooks that really stick, pardon the pun. And it also helps that Grove's writing is pretty damn sharp as well, reminiscent of Special Interest in how they're able to balance out some blistering horniness for the women that they know they can satisfy with some stridently black liberatory leftism, not just to amplify and lean into some of the spiritual elements, but also show some tangible power and targets. Fuck your landlord, it's pretty effective in that regard, especially with some of the vocal samples they integrate, especially that subtle one from a certain video game that really did make me chuckle. Now, I wouldn't call this as layered or pummeling as it could potentially be, and I'm still not really the biggest fan of some of the pitch-shifted approach on Your Boyfriend's Wack, but I also know that's a personal preference of mine, and given how short this is, I am definitely hungry for a lot more here. So yeah, this is pretty much exactly what I like to hear in my electronic hyper-pop music. What a debut EP. Light 8 out of 10. Absolutely deserving of a lot more attention. Next up, the self-titled album from Really Firm. At its core, I will inherit more from you and what you need with me. I feel like my luck with emo and post-hardcore has been so scattered in recent weeks that I was really looking forward to an act impressing me when I was digging up from Bandcamp, and I'll be damned if this Boston band Really From seemed to really get there. If the name doesn't sound familiar, it's because this band was originally called People Like You, and they got some acclaim for blending in a lot of measured indie rock tones and a lot of jazz trumpets with some post-hardcore and even math rock. And when you factor in some really damn sharp and conscious writing, I found myself able to work my way into their compositions with way more ease than I normally find, especially with these subgenres. But as for this self-titled album, what really struck me at first was how their jazz approach, it leans less on traditional math rock or even traditionally abrasive punk, and more towards an act like Black Country New Road from that album earlier this year, more on the experimental rock side, which mirrors a lot of the very deliberate pacing, smoother tones, and frenetic theatricality that lends a very real bigness to certain instrumental passages, especially on cuts like In the Spaces. Again, you get some of that 90s indie element here too. But even with that, there is a sense of tightness to these compositions that lets the groove maintain a sense of tension and even a couple very real hooks, which tend to be my greatest frustration with a lot of these subgenres, even if I do think this project does take a little bit to actually get going. But what I found most potent about this project is a lot of the content building off their previous two albums, structured through the very loose arc of a couple moving into the family house together, which gives some very real weight to immigrant family legacies and expectations that only feel heavier with the passage of time, or the frustration of struggling with languages that might not be your first, or the tokenism of being a minority in America, the tension that comes with being cooped up with your significant other for just too long, probably way too real for a lot of folks after this last year. And while we're on that topic, a lot of the complexities behind the racism and misogyny directed at an Asian women on Yellow Fever, where frontwoman Michitasi, she just nails that barely controlled rage coiling forth both outwards and inwards. But for as much as this album grapples with what cannot be said directly in exploring a lot of intergenerational trauma, it also seeks to dig into questions of place, where you can't ignore where you might be from or where people might think you were from, and that will always shape you, but the focus should be on where you are now, and defining a new story and place for yourself a little bit outside of it. Now, maybe this could have been afforded to be a bit more jagged in spots, but for an album to feel this layered, cutting, and frequently beautiful, hell, maybe I'm starting to find more inroads into these subgenres, because this was absolutely excellent. 8 out of 10, it's gonna be overlooked and underrated by way too many, but I reckon if you've heard it, it's gonna stick. And you'll want to hear it if you haven't. Check it out. Next up from Goody Grace, Don't Forget Where You Came From.
But she likes to smile, and I'm higher than I've ever been. Would you be there to catch me if I...
Okay, full disclosure, I'm a little bit surprised that this Manitoban artist round up on my docket. For one, it's a little tough to put a label on Goody Grace's sound, at least off his first project. He seemed a little closer to acoustic pop, maybe a smattering of emo, but then you get these pop punk or rap pivots and some very weird choices in guest stars that made his sound feel kind of amorphous. I mean, he got his breakthrough with a single with Blink-182 featuring, but ever since then on this project, he's got featuring credits including G-Eazy, Juicy J, Burna Boy, and wait, Anthony Fantano? Yeah, apparently the internet's busiest music nerd actually plays bass on the final song with Mr. Hudson. Go figure, but okay. How is the album here? Well, I do have a better take on it now. Imagine if you have Post Malone's smoked out genre blending in pop, brought in less distinctive textures, vocals, and hooks, and instead of the prominent country or southern rock influences, we get touches of trendier pop punk, especially surrounding suburban and rural disillusionment, and even some of that southern hip hop that makes me reminisce of the stuff that was popular when I was a teenager growing up in the mid-2000s. And there is a part of me looking at songs like Grape, Swisher, Hope That You Miss Me, and maybe Used to Be, that I know if I was 16 back in Winnipeg right now, I could imagine myself defending some of these tracks. The hooks are decently sticky, but that would have also been nearly 15 years ago. And with a broader perspective now, it's hard to ignore just how basic so much of this album feels. Now, a big part of this is Goody Grace himself, whose delivery kind of reminds me a lot of Sean Mullins and is really trying to sound a lot cooler than he is when he really can't bring that much vocal intensity, but it also unfortunately extends to a super clean pop rock framework that doesn't have the muscle or flair and tone or even in the content to really stick out for me. It's competently balanced and produced, sure, but when you drown out a lot of the guitars and reverb to emulate the chilly vibes, and again the Post Malone parallel, it can lead to some really hit and miss results with your guest stars. It might fit with G-Eazy and Cigarettes After Sex decently well, but Juicy J, and especially Burna Boy, who's trying for his western crossover, they just sound awkward here, especially opposite Goody Grace's attempts at a lot of bluesy brooding. And you know, while there is a part of me that is just convinced the majority of this album would just kill as Riverdale background music, that's not exactly a positive when I'm also reminded way too much of a lot of local acts who will go for sounds like this. They might have the hype in a small town scene, but not enough flair or personality to go further. Goody Grace just has better connections and an actual production budget. So even as I might want to stick up for a fellow Manitoban, it's a strong 5 out of 10, mostly because I know I'm going to forget the majority of this in record time. It happens. Next up from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, LW. So I'm confused. Is this just the second half of the project that was released last year that I covered? Because if it was, and they were just trying to space out the double album release, honestly, I'm okay with that. Especially if they were going to continue going into this genre-blending, microtonal direction on KG that actually led to a pretty damn solid album that I wound up going back to a decent bit. And for the most part, that is what this is, a continuation. But let's not mince words. Even if the microtonal compositional structures are similar, and you get a lot of callbacks to psychedelia and vintage thrash that can be easy wins for me, to say nothing of the callbacks to their own material, which are starting to feel a little bit played out, even if KGLW fucking slaps and pretty much justifies the entire project for its 8+ minutes. Fantastic piece. But this album also feels like a less focused and less potent experience overall. More to the point, it can't help but not hit the same heights as KG, mostly because you can tell in the textured grooves, both in the bass and the acoustics, they've really been thickened, and the band leans a fair bit harder on their softer falsetto, which I've never really liked that much for years now, and it's not like the content has evolved much either. In fact, like with the last album, it proceeds with the expected very graphic arc of climate change apocalypse amidst a society that's being misled by religion and the media before collapsing down to actually focus on more local Australian issues and even some of the band's own iconography, which I did not mind on the previous album because the hooks, they had more punch, they showed a little bit more diversity. But if we're gonna keep it real, this feels like a victory lap, even resting on laurels, even if I do think it ends strong. Look, I don't know, I don't want to say this is just another King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard album, especially with their microtonal compositions. They've got a unique lane that I happen to like, and this is still very decent, but for a band as varied as they can be, after the past couple projects, maybe another shakeup is in order, especially in the content by this point. As it is, solid 6 out of 10, it's still good, but I know this band can be great. Hope for more on the horizon. Next up from Architects, For Those That Wish to Exist.
Disasters breaking down my door. I should be moving mountains. The air buckles in the bow.
I may have mentioned a number of times in the past that metalcore is not a genre that really works for me. Between a lot of the subject matter and the monotonous chugging riffs and the stale breakdowns and often frustratingly undercooked melodies, to say nothing of the underwhelming production you got with the mainstream stripe of this sound, a lot of it just runs together. It's not for me, I can acknowledge that. Now, I heard from a lot of peers and fans that Architects were one of those acts who were delivering really strong material in this lane, so I had a lot of hopes that my increased fondness for screamo and even post-hardcore might translate to some albums in their catalog that I would like, and yet the most I'll give them is that their mid-2010s run was alright enough, with the 1-2 punch of All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us and Holy Hell, even if again it was way too clean, way too gent, and stricken with some really limp drum production to really click for me. But then I heard about the furious backlash to their most recent album, apparently due to the pivot to an even cleaner, more bombastic sound with even some symphonic elements that recalled a very specific era of alternative metal, which I actually happen to mostly like, but can't imagine would have been all that much of a surprise, given a lot of the more robust arrangements and steps towards that delivery on Holy Hell. But okay, what do we get with this album? Well, first off, calling this album symphonic just feels wonky for me. I'm a symphonic metal fan. Epica is symphonic. They can at least pay off that swell effectively, whereas Architects' attempts feel painfully undercooked, sterile, and more importantly are chasing what Bring Me the Horizon did 6 goddamn years ago with a smattering of the Imagine Dragon. And of course there's more clean singing, which has never been this band's strong suit even on their better projects, and the percussion is still inconsistent as all hell in between the program beats and the sterile, underweight progressions that they previously had that I did not like, not helped by the open question that where the hell the bass goes on the majority of these songs, opposite a lot of these mechanical gent riffs that just have no impact or tune for me whatsoever. And the album also feels weirdly overcompressed, and the production just does not have a lot of the atmosphere of the last 2 projects, especially given how hard they're trying for it. And I'm wondering what the hell even happened here? They didn't change personnel or producers or a label. This was clearly an artistic pivot that the band wanted to make, even if to me it smacks of some extremely obvious trend chasing for which Architects were never really known. Hell, they got the millennial whoops on here. It's not just trend chasing, but dated trends. But okay, going for a more accessible palette, it doesn't have to be bad. And for somebody who, again, does not really like metalcore, maybe this would work better for me at some level. That kind of worked for Bring Me the Horizon, getting me into them. Well, there's 2 major problems with this. Firstly, even though I know this is not my genre, I know enough to recognize when the sound is done well, and as someone who does mostly know his alternative metal, this is a pretty serious misstep, especially as the hooks are nowhere near as good to differentiate a lot of these songs. And hell, that was a problem in their metalcore era. But what's more alarming and frustrating though is the content. And look, there is a part of me that wants to be sympathetic to Dan Cyril, who pulled Holy Hell together when, in all fairness, the band could have gone their separate ways after Tom Cyril's death. I get it, that was an impressive effort, but as a lyricist on this album, it's pretty rough. Not that the sentiments are bad, the urgency that comes through with addressing climate change, empty religion, those who refuse to acknowledge that danger and know how we're all in this together, those are valid, even if it appears like they're cribbing notes from King Gizzard here. But it feels way thinner than it should, caught up in a lot of nihilistic platitudes and an internal wallow that defaults to a lot of cliches. It just does not have the flair, especially when you get songs like Discourse is Dead that wants to throw up the centrist flag that feels increasingly hollow in these unprecedented times, and especially when you get to Libertine and you get a lot of references to moral degeneration that are frankly a lot more revealing of where their centrism is. But in the end here, even when I know this is not my genre, and even if I think cuts like Meteor and Giving Blood are alright, this did not work at all for me, and I really have to hope Architects don't continue down this road. It's not working. 4 out of 10, I can't recommend it, even for the fans. Next up, from Guapdad 4000 and Illmind 1176.
In the door, how you fill me up. Being by myself is scary, but love is scarier. I'm just trying to make it in America.
Am I the only one kind of shocked that someone wants me to talk about this? I mean, before this, the most I've seen around Guapdad 4000 are a few featuring credits, but I did do my homework. I checked out his 2019 debut, and I gotta be honest, I'm not sure I'm getting the hype. My issue on the debut was inconsistency. He would have a lot of moments that would show a lot of character and energy, and his hooks are absolutely above average. But more often than not, Guapdad 4000's vocals are pretty wispy and lacking expressive presence, with unexceptional flows and content. And even if he has the occasional funny line, when you pair it with some really by-the-numbers trap production and rather questionable choice in guest stars, or really just a mixed bag there, it did not give me a ton of faith that this follow-up with Illmind would be all that special. And, alright, look, I don't want to say this is bad, but I'm not sure it reflects the hype and the potential that Guapdad had a year or two ago. Might be the reason I haven't heard a lot of hype for this. Mostly because this project feels like a retreat into something that's marginally more consistent, but with a fair bit less interesting or distinctive presentation. A big problem is that Guapdad can be a pretty okay storyteller with some funny moments and even some pieces of insight questioning his own lifestyle as he makes a grounding return home on cuts like How Many and Uncle Ricky. I mean, it's nothing to really skip out on that lifestyle or seriously analyze it, and let's be frank, the Kendrick influence is flagrant, but it is a step, but his presentation doesn't do anything to really amplify or differentiate it, especially minus the more varied suite of guests he had last time. He's just a pretty bland performer as a whole. Yeah, the guest stars were mixed, but there were high points. It also doesn't help that his production actually isn't all from Illmind here. By the second song, we get a painfully cheap-sounding snap groove that sounds like it was imported from the mid-2000s, but even from Illmind, I gotta wonder how well a lot of these desaturated samples, creeping off-key, and brittle, sterile cracks of percussion are gonna give Guapdad more flavor. Now, thankfully, a lot of his West Coast influences ensure that most of these trap joints at least have some groove underneath them. Hell, you even get a G-Funk synth on Touch Dough, another song that Illmind didn't produce on this project. And you know what, while we are here, when it comes to a purely bitter breakup song, I will say that Downgrade kinda nails the vibe. And I do think the project ends pretty well, but it also doesn't remotely stand out. I'd say the only reason this got requested was the name and the last remaining traces of his hype, but even that hasn't really lasted. Strong 5 out of 10, only if you're curious, but you've probably heard this before, and you've heard it done better. Next up, from Madison Beer, Life Song.
Say no, I ain't in trouble, just that you since we met. Cause you're toxic, boy, I ain't even gonna try to find the G-O-O-D and goodbye.
Honestly, I'm kind of surprised we didn't get this album sooner. Now, for those of you who don't know, Madison Beer started off doing YouTube covers, she got noticed by Justin Bieber, got signed to his management, and then has been in and around the music scene for a lot longer than you would think to lead to this debut album. Hell, I thought we were gonna get a Madison Beer album back around 2015, where it would have come and gone when she actually had some popular momentum and it seemed like more people cared, but it's taken a lot longer to get some actual groundswell, and frankly, the more I dig into her management situation, the more lingering questions I have. But okay, she put out an EP in 2018, a full length this year, and yet for some ungodly reason, somebody wants me to talk about it, and okay, look, the cliche is that she is a discount Ariana Grande with a far less impressive voice and presence, complete with a lot of undercooked trap pop production that's already starting to feel a bit dated. But for me, the sharper influence might seem to be Lana Del Rey of all people, especially with the thicker cushion of reverb around her, a lot of her husky drawl playing off some smoked out instrumentation, and frankly a lot of the undercooked melodrama, at least until you pick up on the fact that she somehow needs even more flagrant vocal overproduction in order to create some of this vibe, and you start getting a lot of discount Camila Cabello, who isn't good to begin with, especially with a lot of these hideously produced guitars. Look, it's got the feeling of trying to throw way too many pop tropes that might have worked for different artists into a blender from the past 3 or 4 years, but it's not a blend that gives Madison Beer a presence or a unique personality that stands apart from the pack, or flatters any strength she might have, or gives her much in the way of strong pop hooks. I mean, did the songwriting budget all go to licensing that clip of Rick and Morty Season 2 from 5 years ago that doesn't fit at all? Because now we gotta get to a lot of the content here, and look, I think my issue with Madison Beer is that for as much as she really wants to play the numb alien, the capricious seductress, and then being completely overwrought with love-struck angst, which she actually describes as being linked to her struggles with borderline personality disorder, and you know what, that's probably conveyed best on the song Effortlessly, probably one of the best cuts here. More often than not, the vibe does not sell this. It's a lot less intense and more inconsistent, and infatuation with the shallow stylization of it all. Ironically, the more obnoxious this album gets on cuts like Boy Shit and Good and Goodbye, the more the tracks actually stand out to me. And for a project that absolutely runs way too long, it's a mixed blessing. Because a lot of the relationship melodrama just does not have the flair in the performance or the punch in the writing. And no, a lot of the overdone effects all over everything happens for a reason, they don't help matters. In short, there is a part of me that really wants to be generous because this is a debut that's trying to do way too much, and it doesn't feel incompetent in terms of its production or its content. There were some ideas that were at least partially realized here. I get why this would work to maybe a younger audience, but it's a sort of overworked debut that just cannot hold its own weight. Very light 5 out of 10, and I'm gonna be honest, I'm gonna forget this in record time. Next up from Nick Jonas, Spaceman.
I don't know how this could get much better than you and me here right now. This is heaven.
I don't know why this exists. And if that sounds crass, well, it is. But seriously, I thought Nick Jonas was putting his solo career on pause, given that his momentum kind of stalled out 5 years ago, and the Jonas Brothers are doing their own thoroughly mediocre comeback as a group. Did somebody actually tell them that Happiness Begins was bad, and that Nick Jonas was better off going back on his own? Because if so, I'm not precisely complaining. Again, Happiness Begins was a bad album, but I am surprised that anyone wants me to talk about it, especially this new project that came out of nowhere and seems to have precisely zero hype, at least from what I've seen. And now having heard it, well, look, you could argue that it's because as this album starts, you're left with the impression that it hasn't really solved any of Nick Jonas's issues, with a lot of very cold, monochromatic production. Hi, Greg Kirsten, not surprised to see you here. That feels significantly clumsier than it really should to support a frontman whose charisma seems to come and go in patches with a lot of the auto-tune, but now with even fewer original ideas, courtesy of the trap R&B approach that seems to treat any sort of faded, bleeping instrumental with passing disinterest, in favor of a lot of the grooves that, again, are probably this album's soul-saving grace, at least until about halfway through. Then, with no warning and some truly ugly synth horns that apparently Nick Jonas is convinced that nobody will tell aren't real. But then the album transitions towards this soft-focused pop R&B that puts me in the mind of everyone trying to rip off Lionel Richie's dance pop side in the mid-80s, only keeping in a few hi-hat skitters and lyrical cadences to keep it more contemporary. Seriously, it's actually kind of uncanny how much Nick Jonas will commit to the pivot. The padded grooves are more textured, the multi-tracked harmonies are more flared flagrantly retro. The guitars, and especially the synth lines, have a little bit more misty rollic. There's a sax solo that comes in, and it makes me wonder if at some point Nick Jonas was just stealing a lot of notes from Niall Horan or the 1975's revival of this sort of 80s soft rock, and that's before he outright samples I Wanna Know What Love Is by Foreigner. And when you think that you might actually just be enjoying the vibe, the album then yanks itself back to muted trap and R&B with Death Do Us Part, and the album tries for a jerky, synth-inflected power ballad to end things out that feels right out of a lot of bad modern boy band territory, and I'm thinking, you had all of that 80s bombast. Why did you leave that territory? There was a fragment of a workable idea there, and it's completely squandered thanks to no real commitment to it. Ironic, given that Nick Jonas is very much in husband mode across this album, and structured the entire arc of the album into segments, highlighting very much an emotional distance that he's working through to bridge through some loose hedonism to reaffirm the commitment that he has to his wife. Now, you know what, to his credits, the lyrical reference points are not as cringeworthy or as clunky as his last project, because they were a real issue there, but that's because he swapped out a lot of his awkward or ugly metaphors for interchangeable or derivative ones. Hell, he even leans onto a religious element on This Is Heaven, and even if it is one of the best hooks on the entire project, it's about as clunky as when Justin Bieber did it on Holy. But at the end of the day, yeah, you know what, the midsection nudges this album into some trace of quality, and some of the hooks and grooves are legit good, but Nick Jonas remains an artist who seems to be chasing the safest, least interesting version of his own ideas, and that holds him back for me. Light 6 out of 10, and even then, I think I'm being generous. Next up from Selena Gomez, Revelación.
Soy más fuerte sola.
How can I say that I both had and didn't have expectations for this EP? Because on the one hand, the singles that she released sounded pretty damn good for this brand of reggaeton. And if Selena Gomez was pursuing a passion project like this, I don't know, maybe it would be a nice little divergence from some very frustratingly middle-of-the-road pop music she's been churning out for years. But let's be real, as much as I like Selena Gomez more than the majority of critics, it's not like I expected this to be anything more than a light side project that was very much designed to clinch a spot in the international markets. If it was good, that'd be more of a bonus than an actual feature. But I'll be damned if this isn't some of the most focused material that Selena Gomez has ever released, because it lets Selena Gomez lock into a singular lane within reggaeton. That why it might not be all that unique within the subgenre. It's probably the most consistent production she's ever had, especially from Taney. And given that she sounds comfortable with Spanish, at least in comparison with me, these are probably some of the most relaxed and naturally charismatic vocals she's ever delivered against the softer production. Yeah, a lot of the textured knock of the percussion leaning on some of the touches of Latin trap, and even some of the more spacious guitars, the wispy woodwinds, and even some of the keyboard touches, they are nothing new in the subgenre from my familiarity with it. And women who are pushing the boundaries of this sound, they've got nothing to worry about from Selena Gomez's much softer focus and presentation. But it is a lane that seems to work for her, and to her credit, from what I translate from the content, it fits in the lane crafted off of Rare, finally breaking free of her lingering pain and chasing some fleeting love off the dance floor. Although Raul Alejandro and Mike Towers don't really do the best of jobs endearing themselves for me. But you know what? I think the most interesting part of her story is that by the end of this EP, she's the one who is strong enough to be able to end things on her own terms. Maybe go back to that old guy who broke her heart, or just cast her new lane. Not quite the bad bitch era that Cardi B wants for her, but it is a step forward. But you know what? I think I need to call in an expert for this. Let's not just take it from me.
Hey, Mark. Mark. I'm the Funky Bunch. Hey. Hi, my name is Rodrigo Pasta. I'm from Argentina and I review music like my buddy Mark. Revelación is quite the interesting achievement, since it might as well be a collaboration project between two artists destined to cross paths at some point, Selena Gomez and producer Tiny. In case you're not aware, Tiny is one of the biggest and one of the best Latin producers currently working, a living legend who's produced enormous hits for J Balvin, Bad Bunny, and tons of others. 6 out of the 7 songs on Revelación are co-written and produced by him, as well as his songwriting team from his label Neon 16, and the tropes he's built throughout the years are in full force here. De Una Vez and Vicio pull off intense atmospheres where the rays of sunshine disguised as sins brush Selena's skin as there's this feeling of freedom right around the corner. But stuff like Buscando Amor and Dámelo Todo reveal the naughtier, darker side of his sound, with echoes, loops, and samples that point towards a night that's a tad too intense to be remembered, but too haunted to be forgotten. These are biting sounds that don't go hard enough because they have to make way for Selena's voice. A mixed blessing here. On one hand, I appreciate her trying to come out with a lyrical and thematic arc for this little project, a woman finally feeling safe enough to open up again and hit the streets, only to meet a guy who fulfills her sexually and emotionally, and when the trash ex comes back, she dumps him with no regrets. And then a DJ Snake song at the end to boost the stream, so we don't talk about that one. However, as for her performance, it's a funny thing. She's clearly not a natural at speaking Spanish, let alone singing it, but that somehow adds to her performance. She adds this spirit of uncanny valley that the sounds end up thriving on. She mispronounces simple words, and the tones have to make up for that. It's quite a fascinating experience, even more so when you hear she's quite committed to this. But while that's great for the upbeat songs, especially Baila Conmigo, which might be the song of the year, with Selena being intentionally overshadowed by Rauw Alejandro, a hot knife blistering into the sun, the more gray moments in which she needs to display emotion or some kind of agency or power fall flat. They become more interesting than they do good. And the sounds are so busy trying to adjust to her, they lose that biting power that they could have. A gift and a curse, everything about the CP. Too bad, because it could have been one of the great experiments in pop music of the past few years, but as it stands, there's one great gem, some shining moments, and then a bunch of compromises. Thank you, Mark, for giving my lengthy thoughts a platform. Speaking of platforms, aside from my YouTube channel, I also have a Substack where I review albums far beyond pop music, a new edition of that coming soon, as well as a Patreon for my YouTube channel if anyone's interested in supporting me. Thank you for listening to me. Now back to Mark.
But yeah, even though it's a lightweight side EP, I actually wound up mostly liking this. Solid 6 out of 10. But while we're in this territory, last up from Justin Bieber, Justice. Am I the only one who finds what Justin Bieber is doing right now so very deeply ironic? Last year he put out an album where he was all about being very comfortable in his relationship and proving that he can make some of the most interchangeable and forgettable trap and R&B imaginable. It was the moment where he was looking to convince the world that he has moved on, he was a better man, and yet less than a year later, we're on an album that is so very obviously structured as a redemption arc. I thought you moved past all this, Bieber. Why plead and then demand so much forgiveness from your audience? It would feel so utterly bizarre until you realize that it's less about the scandal and more that changes underperformed commercially, especially in comparison with Purpose. And apparently the quarantine gave Justin Bieber plenty of additional time to record instead of touring in to support a bad album, and especially given, again, Bieber's messy past has had surprising staying power in the cultural zeitgeist. He can lean on the grand tradition of the label-driven rebrand and the reconciliation. Because let's be real, when you factor in the Afrobeat pivots, the references towards God that shade just how much he slips in pleas for forgiveness, and a bunch of snippets of speeches from Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, doesn't that feel like the sort of label hackery you would expect from a promo team that's trying desperately to make things right with the incredulous audience who hasn't really forgotten all of Justin Bieber's scandals? And you know what, I gotta bring up the team here, because if there is an album that feels so goddamn calculated in trying to stabilize the Justin Bieber brand, it's this one. There's not a single song here that feels unique to him, a sound that he can call his own, and that in nearly every single case, the guest star are just gonna walk away with the song unless their names just happen to be Kid Laroi or Chance the Rapper, and dear God, Chance, you should have been better on Holy. Ironically, this is just an extension of the problem I have with Changes, in that Justin Bieber's greatest problem is his lack of unique personality, especially in his compositions. His second greatest problem is the balancing act he's trying to pull pull between asking for forgiveness and trying to convey more relatability by mentioning just how hard he loves his wife in order to make up for how much he does not love himself. And since Justin Bieber's vocal presence is so antiseptic and sterile on this project, as is a lot of his production, which in comparison with Changes, it at least sounds like it's got a little bit more of a budget behind him, I can't help but feel the mechanism that's working behind Bieber. I can see the label, and it doesn't help him feel all that sincere. And that's not saying there aren't good songs. The 80s inspired pivot, it was obvious, and it has been done a lot better. Hell, it could have been done better by any number of his co-writers, especially John Bellion. He could have kept those songs for himself, but Anyone and Ghost, they're really good. And there are tracks that are redeemed by their guest stars, like Peaches with Giveon and Daniel Caesar, which is probably going to go to number 1, and maybe Die For You with Dominic Fike, and they do make up for some of the utter duds that show up here. And when you factor in how one-note and sloppily sequenced the album is, ending with Lonely, that is just wrong. But you know what? This feels like a brand stabilization more than a consistent quality of an album, and I've never been enamored with this brand. So, strong 4 out of 10. I'll reiterate the same question I've had for years. At this point, how much more do we really need from Justin Bieber? Because I'm about done. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got through a lot here and may have said a lot. Thanks a lot for Rodrigo Basta for showing up to help me with Selena Gomez. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to go subscribe to his Patreon and Substack. He's got a lot of work that he's putting out, and I've admired a lot of his work for a long time. Happy to work with him here. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. I'm sure I said something controversial, so comments, have fun. But beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in my schedule or helps argue with me on my Discord, link to my Patreon right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. It's tough times out there for everyone. The option's available. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.